cervical curvature, cervical curvature, thoracic curvature, thoracic curvature, lumbar curvature, lumbar curvature, pelvic curvature, pelvic curvature, articular facet, articular facet, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, intervertebral foramen, intervertebral foramen, sacrum, sacrum, coccyx, coccyx, cervical vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, body of vertebra, body of vertebra, spinal segment, spinal segment, spinous process, spinous process, spinal nerve, cauda equina, cauda equina, cervical nerves, cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, lumbar nerves, sacral nerves, sacral nerves, brain, brain, cervical spinal nerves, cervical spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, sacral spinal nerves, sacral spinal nerves, conus medullaris, conus medullaris, filum terminale, filum terminale, spinal cord, epidural space, epidural space, subarachnoid space, subarachnoid space, spinal cord, pia mater, dorsal root, ventral root, spinal nerve, dorsal branch, ventral branch, ramus communicans, duramater, arachnoid, dorsal rootlets, ventral rootlets, spinal ganglion, dorsal nerve root, gray matter, ventral nerve root, central canal, posterior horn, lateral horn, dorsal root ganglion, interior horn, spinous process, transverse process, herniation of nucleus pulposus, intervertebral disc, nucleus pulposus, annulus fibrosus, spinal nerve root, posterior longitudinal ligament, interior longitudinal ligament, intervertebral disc, nucleus pulposus, annulus fibrosus, section body of vertebra, supraspinous ligament, spinous process, interspinous ligament, ligamentum flavum, vertebral foramen, pedicle, transverse process, lamina, vertebral body, vertebral arch, spinous process, intervertebral foramen, transverse foramen, transverse process, superior articular facet, vertebral foramen, bifid spinous process, bifid spinous process, body, body, lamina, lamina, superior articular surface, superior articular surface, dens, dens, spinous process, spinous process, facet that articulates with dens, facet that articulates with dens, facet that articulates with occipital condyle, facet that articulates with occipital condyle, posterior articular facet, posterior articular facet, dens, dens, atlas C1, atlas C1, axis C2, axis C2, C3, C3, C4, C4, superior articular process and facet, superior articular process and facet, transverse foramen, transverse foramen, pedicle, pedicle, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, vertebral foramen, vertebral foramen, facet that articulates with rib head, facet that articulates with rib head, vertebral foramen, vertebral foramen, superior articular facet, superior articular facet, transverse process, transverse process, body, body, pedicle, pedicle, lamina, lamina, transverse costal facet, transverse costal facet, spinous process, spinous process, superior costal facet, superior costal facet, inferior costal facet, inferior costal facet, inferior vertebral notch, inferior vertebral notch, superior articular process and facet, superior articular process and facet, pedicle, pedicle, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, superior articular process, superior articular process, costal facet of transverse process, costal facet of transverse process, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, ribdi, ribdi, costal cartilage, costal cartilage, superior costal facet, superior costal facet, vertebral body, vertebral body, inferior costal facet, inferior costal facet, sternum, sternum, costovertebral joint, costovertebral joint, rib, rib, costotransverse joint, costotransverse joint, sacral promontory, sacral promontory, interior sacral foramina, interior sacral foramina, transverse ridges, transverse ridges, superior articular process, superior articular process, sacrum, sacrum, coccyx, coccyx, sacral canal, sacral canal, intermediate sacral crest, intermediate sacral crest, sacral horn, sacral horn, median sacral crest, median sacral crest, auricular surface, auricular surface, dorsal sacral foramina, dorsal sacral foramina, sacral hiatus, sacral hiatus, celodersica, celodersica, sphenoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, clivus, clivus, nasopharynx, nasopharynx, interior arch of atlas, interior arch of atlas, axis, axis, oropharynx, oropharynx, esophagus, esophagus, epiglottis, epiglottis, larynx, larynx, CSF in subarachnoid space, CSF in subarachnoid space, spinal cord, spinal cord, interior longitudinal ligament, interior longitudinal ligament, trachea, trachea, manubrium of sternum, manubrium of sternum, cerebellum, cerebellum, pons, pons, medulla oblongata, medulla oblongata, cisterna magna, cisterna magna, dens, dens, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, spinous process, spinous process, CSF in subarachnoid space, CSF in subarachnoid space, posterior longitudinal ligament, posterior longitudinal ligament, oropharynx, oropharynx, parotid gland, parotid gland, right internal carotid artery, right internal carotid artery, transverse process, transverse process, vertebral canal, vertebral canal, cerebrospinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, tongue, tongue, ramus of mandible, ramus of mandible, interior arch, dens, dens, transverse foramen, transverse foramen, lamina, lamina, posterior arch, right external carotid artery, right external carotid artery, right internal carotid artery, right internal carotid artery, right jugular vein, right jugular vein, vertebral artery, vertebral artery, vertebral canal, ligamentum flavum, ligamentum flavum, mandible, mandible, larynx, larynx, cervical vertebra, cervical vertebra, transverse foramen, transverse foramen, subarachnoid space, subarachnoid space, spinous process, spinous process, trachea, trachea, esophagus, esophagus, interior longitudinal ligament, interior longitudinal ligament, thoracic aorta, thoracic aorta, body of T1, body of T1, CSF in subarachnoid space, CSF in subarachnoid space, posterior longitudinal ligament, posterior longitudinal ligament, ligamentum flavum, ligamentum flavum, spinous process, spinous process, spinal cord, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, herniation intervertebral disc, herniation intervertebral disc, body of T12, body of T12, ascending aorta, thoracic vertebra body, thoracic vertebra body, head of rib, spinal cord, superior articular process, epiphyseal joint, inferior articular process, transverse process, esophagus, thoracic aorta, costovertebral joint, subarachnoid space, costotransverse joint, spinous process, body of L1, interior longitudinal ligament, intervertebral disc, sacrum, spinal cord, conus medullaris, ligamentum flavum, spinous process, cauda equina, posterior longitudinal ligament, CSF, herniation intervertebral disc, thecal sac, phylum terminale, right common iliac artery, right common iliac vein, body of vertebra, spinal nerve root, spinal nerve root, superior articular process, superior articular process, facet joint, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, lamina, left common iliac artery, psoas muscle, CSF, cauda equina, erector spinae muscle, spinous process, sacrum, gluteus maximus muscle, iliac bone, iliac wing, sacroiliac joint, spinal nerve root, terminal theca, erector spinae muscle, liver, right kidney, ureter, intervertebral disc L2/L3, intervertebral disc L2/L3, right common iliac artery, iliac bone, spleen, left kidney, lumbar artery, psoas muscle, iliac wing, left common iliac artery, gluteus medius muscle, pedicle, CSF, sacral plexus, spinal cord, spinal nerve root, sacrum, sacroiliac joint, gluteus maximus muscle, cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar spine, sacrum, coccyx, ramus of mandible, dens, transverse foramen, vertebral canal, atlas, interior arch, transverse process, lamina, posterior arch, superior articular process, epiphyseal joint, inferior articular process, cervical vertebra body, larynx, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, spinous process, sphenoid sinus, clivus, nasopharynx, interior arch of atlas, axis, oropharynx, epiglottis, hyoid bone, orifice of esophagus, vocal ligament, larynx, esophagus, trachea, occipital bone, foramen magnum, dens, spinous process, vertebral canal, intervertebral disc, occipital condyle, atlanto-occipital joint, atlantoaxial joint, transverse foramen, vertebral body, first rib, lung apex, external auditory meatus, transverse process, costovertebral joint, atlantoaxial joint, transverse process, costotransverse joint, costovertebral joint, atlas, axis, first rib, epiphyseal joint, rib, spinous process, right main bronchus, thoracic vertebra, vertebral canal, superior articular process, transverse process, left main bronchus, esophagus, costovertebral joint, rib, costotransverse joint, spinous process, vertebral body, lamina, pedicle, vertebral arch, superior articular process, epiphyseal joint, inferior articular process, aorta, trachea, sternum, body of T1, spinous process, CSF in subarachnoid space, vertebral canal, intervertebral disc, sacrum, coccyx, esophagus, tracheal bifurcation, superior articular process, intervertebral foramen, inferior articular process, epiphyseal joint, lung apex, right lung, right main bronchus, liver, right kidney, psoas muscle, transverse process, sacrum, rib, costovertebral joint, left lung, left main bronchus, spleen, aorta, left kidney, intervertebral disc, iliac bone, sacroiliac joint, right lung, inferior articular process, superior articular process, spinous process, costotransverse joint, epiphyseal joint, vertebral canal, rib, thoracic vertebra, costovertebral joint, transverse process, spinous process, intervertebral foramen, costotransverse joint, inferior vena cava, psoas muscle, pedicle, vertebral arch, vertebral arch, erector spinae muscle, abdominal area, lumbar vertebra body, vertebral canal, transverse process, lamina, spinous process, right common iliac artery, superior articular process, epiphyseal joint, left common iliac artery, intervertebral foramen, sacrum, iliac bone, sacroiliac joint, lumbar vertebra body, intervertebral disc, vertebral canal, spinous process, cauda equina, ligamentum flavum, superior articular process, intervertebral foramen, inferior articular process, epiphyseal joint, sacrum, liver, right kidney, intervertebral disc, psoas muscle, iliac bone, left kidney, lumbar vertebra body, rib, superior articular process, inferior articular process, ilium, sacrum, vertebral canal, transverse process, epiphyseal joint, sacroiliac joint, rib, intervertebral disc, sacrum, coccyx, costovertebral joint, lumbar vertebra body, transverse process, sacroiliac joint, sacral foramina, lumbar vertebra body, intervertebral foramen, spinous process, costotransverse joint, odontoid process, foramen magnum, occipital bone, transverse process, trachea, first rib, lung apex, mastoid air cell, mandibular angle, intervertebral disc, vertebral body, costotransverse joint, costovertebral joint, clavicle, nasopharynx, atlas, oropharynx, mandible, larynx, hyoid bone, epiglottis, esophagus, internal occipital protuberance, axis, inferior articular process, superior articular process, facet joint, spinous process, spinous process, C7, C7, hyoid bone, hyoid bone, pedicle, pedicle, lamina, lamina, trachea, trachea, first rib, clavicle, clavicle, inferior articular process, inferior articular process, superior articular process, superior articular process, intervertebral foramen, intervertebral foramen, spinous process, spinous process, facet joint, costotransverse joint, costotransverse joint, nasal septum, mastoid air cell, occipital bone, atlantoaxial joint, ramus of mandible, zygomatic, metal wire and facial mask, odontoid process, atlas, axis, spinous process, clavicle, pedicle, diaphragm, liver, transverse process, facet joint, inferior articular process, crina, costovertebral joint, heart, spinous process, superior articular process, humerus head, intervertebral disc, intervertebral foramen, pedicle, intervertebral disc, spinous process, iliac bone, sacrum, hip joint, rib, transverse process, sacroiliac joint, superior articular process, intervertebral foramen, inferior articular process, facet joint, ear, superior articular process, nose, transverse process, eye, pedicle, neck, pars interarticularis, leg, inferior articular process, sacrum, hip joint, facet joint, tail, superior articular process, body, lamina, iliac bone, sacroiliac joint, fracture of the pars interarticularis, spinous process, sacrum, iliac bone, hip joint, pubic, obturator foramen, transverse process, sacral foramina, sacroiliac joint, coccyx, femoral head, pubic symphysis, ischium, femur head, great sciatic notch, cervical spine, cervical curvature, thoracic spine, thoracic spine, thoracic curvature, thoracic curvature, lumbar spine, lumbar spine, lumbar curvature, lumbar curvature, sacrum, sacrum, coccyx, coccyx, pelvic curvature, pelvic curvature, gonadal shield, gonadal shield, lumbar vertebra, lumbar vertebra, intervertebral disc, intervertebral disc, sacrum, sacrum, cauda equina, cauda equina, subarachnoid space, subarachnoid space, terminal theca, terminal theca, disc herniation, disc herniation,